I'm Joseph Monack, out in Woodstock, and friends with Joe. Met him through politics, and today we just decided to hold kind of an interview.
Yeah, my name is Joe Kopsick. I ran for U.S. House of Representatives 3 times from Illinois, Wisconsin, and Oregon. Currently live in Waukegan, Illinois. We're in my apartment right now. And I'm just here to talk about the blog that I've been managing for the last 8.5 years, Aquarian Agrarian, and the couple of books that I'm selling on that blog, Libertarian Conspiracy Theories, Soft Communism for 90s Kids, and Time, Money, Moon Value.
What do you think the federal government would look like under a libertarian administration?
So I endorse what Ron Paul has been saying, his idea to get rid of 5 federal departments and with it 5 cabinet posts: commerce, education, energy, interior, and HUD, housing and urban development. Commerce and energy because they're repositories of corporate greed and cronyism. Education because they're propagandizing your children and wasting your money. Interior because the government should not be owning so much land. And HUD because the government mismanages inner cities and some insurance fraud that goes on with the way they allocate land in some cases. So aside from having competitive currency and mail delivery, reducing dependence on police and military by allowing us to defend ourselves, there's really not much else that we need to shrink in the federal government aside from giving the entitlements over to the states to say manage themselves or have federal block grants that the states manage the enforcement of those laws. So there is a way to basically get rid of most or all of the federal government, and we have to remain open to that possibility.
Do you think that free trade is compatible with free market?
I do think it is, and it's unfortunate that free trade has gotten somewhat of a bad reputation and a bad name because of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association, I believe. And Gary Johnson, I agree with what he said in 2016, which is that free trade does not require a treaty. It shouldn't require a law. It shouldn't require multilateral negotiations by multiple governments. It should just require, firms and people and workers coordinating independently through markets that are interconnected and worldwide, and in which most or anyone can start competing, especially against monopolies, because I like to know that it's illegal to compete against monopolies. And if you have monopolies anywhere, you can't have free markets. And I advocate, as part of the free trade, free market idea, I advocate the free flow of labor and capital to anywhere in the world, regardless of international borders. I think borders, and especially border walls, protectionism, travel checkpoints can all be an inhibition to the free flow of labor and capital, which is essential to free markets if you study what's called the fundamental theorems of welfare economics.
Why do you say that you support globalization but not globalism?
Well, globalism to me suggests central government and government direction of resources, government direction of economic policies. And I support something that's referred to as ultra globalization. It's an alternative to the so-called the neoliberal approach to globalization. I support economic globalization in that means internationally interconnected markets. Not to say that land speculators should have the right to steal the land out from underneath us, but just that the labor and capital on top of that land should be free to move around and free to change ownership and possession, whether that's individual, cooperative, or if you're referring to location. But I want less global governance, but more economic globalization in the sense of free markets all over the world.
Could you tell us about agorism?
Agorism is it's a philosophy centered on the black market, but it's surprising. Black markets they're not known for their openness, but agorism literally refers to open markets. And agorism, it focuses on prohibited activities that are prohibited for no good reason. That is, prohibit economic exchanges and transactions. That is, victimless crimes that are taxed or regulated or illegal for no good reason. And most libertarians would say that tax evasion, drug use and sale, and prostitution, sex work, all fall under those categories. And we favor things like jury nullification to make the things that criminalize those behaviors we want to invalidate those laws that criminalize those behaviors so we can have free economic exchange, so we can have at least some kind of relief of poverty.
What are red, gray, and white markets?
Well, while black markets refer to criminalized activity that harms no one, white markets are legal activities that harm no one. Gray markets are in a gray area, such as under the table or untaxed work. And red markets are things like murder for hire and sex slavery, things that are rightfully illegal but are in a way economic exchanges. But just because they're economic exchanges does not mean that they're permissible behaviors. But we have to distinguish between whether an economic activity is good or bad, aside from whether it's illegal or illegal. We have to distinguish legality from morality. And that's where this agorist idea of black, gray, white, red, and pink markets come from.
Could you tell us about this guy, Pierre Joseph Proudhon? Did I say that right?
Yes. Pierre Joseph Proudhon was a mutualist, anarchist, philosopher, and economist, and he was also in the French National Assembly, so he was a politician and an anarchist at the same time. I think one of the first, if not the first, self-described anarchists. And his contribution to economic theory is mutualism, and that is an economic theory based on reciprocity and exchanging equal values, whether you're exchanging labor or capital or both or whatever. He said that property is theft and that property is impossible, but he also said that order is anarchy. There's a lot of kind of short terms that are associated with him that can be kind of difficult to sort out. And that is why the Libertarian Socialist Caucus of the Libertarian Party exists and has been saying things like rent is theft. What Proudhon and the Libertarian Socialist Caucus mean when we say things like property is theft, rent is theft, property is impossible, rent is taxation, all that stuff, is basically saying that most property claims could not and would not exist if it were not for so much state interference to prop up the owners of most of the property and to protect their already existing assets in banks with, of course, security guards and or police who are either directly working for the government or licensed according to government standards. So in effect, most, if not everyone, who's protecting other people's property and assets are working for the government in some way, shape, or form, or at least abiding to their standards. So in a way, we kind of have just a partial privatization of the responsibility to enforce people's property claims. And if you think about it, why should the state be registering and then claiming it protects these people's property claims, but then not really doing anything about it, only if they really care to? And then you start to wonder, do the cops actually have a responsibility to protect people, or is it property? And I've done some research that concludes they have more of a responsibility to protect people. And I don't think that's what the police should be for. And if the police are already protecting property, then why do we need private security guards protecting property additionally? So there's just a lot of questions about how much property is protected by the state and what the set of existing property claims would be if the libertarians were actually consistent and wanted to get rid of the state, which should entail getting rid of all state registration and protection of state property, of private property. And I should also note that in the mutualist and anarchist understanding and communist understanding of private property, it doesn't just refer to ordinary everyday goods like mass-produced things and possessions, things that can be easily moved. Private property, when anarchists use, or economists even, use the term, anyone but libertarians, it refers to individually owned private property, which is wielded exclusively or in a dominionistic fashion, a monopolistic fashion, to the exclusion of other people, especially when other people rely on that capital or that land or that asset to sustain a living. And that takes away their ability to be independent. And when you don't give people the opportunity to actually acquire property and land and capital and credit, they just become dependent on a welfare state. So in a way, Ron Paul is right when he says voluntary socialism would probably be preferable to a welfare state.
Isn't libertarianism supposed to be about capitalism and private property?
That's what the vast majority of libertarians will tell you, but myself and people in the Libertarian Socialist Caucus feel that libertarians focus too much on private property and capital, because I believe that capitalism, I believe that the term itself denotes a systematic or even governmental or on some level official prioritization of the interests of capital and the owners of capital, by inference, capital over the interests of people who work, who sell their labor for a living, who earn wages, and people who want to have access to land. So as a result of this, labor and land are lumped into capital in the minds of both some kind of liberal economists and also libertarians. And we've just lost the idea that there are three basic economic categories. They're land, labor, and capital, and we need to learn to differentiate them. We can't just treat them all as if they're inanimate, objects. The earth is alive. The things on it are, there are creatures on it that are alive. And people who are working for the interests of capitalists, they also have human needs. So we can't just pretend it's all dead capital, just sell it and let the chips fall where they fall. There has to be some human element to it.
You believe that private law and anarchism are compatible, and that private actors could replace all state functions. Could you explain what private law is, and whether you think privatizing everything is the way to go?
Well, I don't like the term privatize everything, and I think it has been kind of harmful in the libertarian movement. I do like the idea of privatization if it's this term radical privatization. See, regular privatization is when the government actively takes assets that are previously publicly owned and hands them over to some private agency or independent agency, which is just private, or a public-private partnership or something. So that's government-directed privatization. And in that, government's taking an active role in privatization. As a libertarian, I don't like that. But in radical privatization, the government simply, a government agency is just abolished, and government just gets out of the way in terms of a certain issue, and the people, whoever wants to, is left to fill that role. And we don't know if we're going to replace it with government, markets, democratic planning, voluntary association, could be anything. But as long as government gets out of the way, there's no limit to what the alternatives could be. And that should apply not just to things, consumer goods that are provided in the market. It should apply to every industry and service. And the government is monopolizing at least 18 different legal services, such as contract enforcement, property and person protection, national collective defense, dispute resolution and adjudication, and private law, contract law, private arbitration, private investigation, private prisons to some extent, all provide alternatives to that. But the problem with just saying privatize everything across the board is this. You risk putting the illusion out there that you might just want to turn everything into a for-profit system where the government actively privatizes. So if you let the government get out of the way and let nonprofit cooperatives fill the role, they're minimally government affiliated or not governmentally affiliated at all and run on their own standard systems or run based on standards that are set up by independent organizations, such as this organization you can read about in the article version of this interview called the ISO, not the Trotskyist ISO, but it's a standardization organization. They develop industrial standards. So why don't we depoliticize where we get our standards from? And with that, maybe we could depoliticize the regulation of industry and kind of have economics run more smoothly and according to something that we can have more consensus in. And if we can develop nonprofit cooperative alternatives to government provision of legal services, then we can have alternatives to how the government forces itself into the resolution of our disputes so that we can end our conflicts, resolve our conflicts without inviting the state involved and risking all the terror and getting bogged down in years of defending ourselves in court that can come with that. And key people whose writing has been important is good to read if you want to learn more about private law. Include Robert Murphy, Roderick T. Long, David D. Friedman, and Samuel Congan.
You have said that ethical consumerism is impossible because boycotts are illegal. What do you mean by that, and why do you believe that repealing the Taft-Hartley Act is the best way to solve that problem?
Well, the selling point of our market system, the idea that it's fair, comes from the idea that we can vote with our wallet, that we could choose to buy from or not buy from, and as a consequence, boycott and not boycott whoever we want. But is that really true? I mean, think about it. Think of all the different, bailouts, subsidies, easy credit loans, intellectual property protections, all these different things that businesses get that are paid for with taxpayer money. Is it really them who's creating jobs and money for us, or is it them legally colluding with the government to take our opportunities to compete against them and then depriving us of all opportunity to acquire enough money to be taxed in the first place? And that's why the poor have less of a share of the tax burden. It's not because they're lazy or anything like that. We need to abolish subsidies if we expect boycotts to really be effective. But the next thing we need to do is also another huge, impossible thing, like abolishing subsidies altogether for businesses, is repealing Taft-Hartley, because doing that will allow us to have effective, coordinated boycotts, because the Taft-Hartley Act criminalized in the private sector coordinated boycotts and sympathy boycotts. There are these labor actions wherein a business that has sympathy for another strike or boycott that's going on will decide to, all the workers at that workplace will decide to join in that boycott or strike. And business interests colluded with the government in 1947 to prevent strikers and people who want boycotts from being able to have widespread effective boycotts, because it was leading to things like, union labels and really effective coordinated boycotts. And it was perfectly legal and voluntary. They just wanted to stop it. So there's no reason those behaviors shouldn't be legal, and they're only perceived as involuntary or wrong by libertarians, if they even think about them at all, because they're criminalized. They don't need to be criminalized. We need to repeal Taft-Hartley so that we can have real effective boycotts and strikes with very limited ability of government and union leaders to stop them.
What do you think of right-to-work laws?
I used to be in favor of them, but I was in Wisconsin at the time, and I flipped on them around the same time that Scott Walker decided, because he was against them and decided to be for them. So it was Friedrich Hayek's comments on right to work, just basically focusing on the fact that, hey, it's a state law. It's probably going to have some bad consequences. Just think about it. Of course it's bad. So here's what's wrong with it. It limits the ability of workers and hirers, or workers and managers, to make a contract with each other that gives the union security. It criminalizes union security agreements, agreements which require all workers to either join the union or a union, which are referred to as union shop and closed shop agreements. So it criminalizes those types of contracts. And as a libertarian, we're supposed to believe that government's role is to refrain from interfering with the obligation of contracts, and instead recognize contracts as basically law that comes from the people. It's sort of a common law, private law idea. It fits into it. And I've written a lot about right to work, probably one of the things I've written most on. And it's really just a band-aid for bad federal laws that were written even 20 years before that, like the Wagner Act. It required a lot of sectors, a lot of industries in the private sector to submit to the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, for the supervision of union elections. And the Wagner Act required not all private sector business, but just most of them, at least half. It required them to conduct those elections on majority vote. So sometimes, people are forced into uncomfortable votes that they either don't feel qualified to vote in, or they don't like the outcome. But either way, minorities are not given as much right to organize it. Basically, most places are not given any right to, prompt negotiation with management. It's only given to the majority. But people like Bernie Sanders and I think Mark Pocan have come up with the idea of lowering that threshold to below majority. But there's also a thing called minority unionism that just they have it in Japan, and they have multiple unions in most workplaces. Also, dual unionism is a related idea, and in Japan, it's supposedly very easy to go like quit one union and join another. And in the sense, there's competition between unions, and that's good. It might have the result of producing some unions that will sell out people's right to negotiate and get more benefits in the future. But you would also have more radical unions. You'd have at least a diversity of who could represent you in the workplace.
Could you tell us about mutualism and market socialism, and why do you think that they're preferable to capitalism and socialism?
Mutualism and market socialism are kind of compromises between a socialist and a free market system. They combine socialist ownership or collective ownership of the means of production with retaining market-based systems of allocation and distribution. And mutualism focuses on reciprocity of trade, trading equal amounts, as I said before. And so there's something in mutualism called the cost principle. The term cost the limit of price. It refers to how prices can only be justified according to cost. There should not be, if a person can avoid paying unnecessary surplus profit on a product or service to someone, they should avoid it for the purpose of just economically they should. Why shouldn't they, why shouldn't they have that savings? So there's all this unnecessary money that's being made in capitalism that mutualism recognizes. And that's usury, which is excess interest. There's profits in businesses that are really just kept wages, if it's surplus profits, super profits, as Marx called it. And there's also rent that's kept by the landlord or owner, and that rent should be spent in the community. And that's a thing that Georgism recognizes. But above all, mutualism and market socialism, they both stand to provide kind of a common ground between how free marketers want to keep market systems and market pricing, and socialists who want to increase the amount of property that collectives own as opposed to individual owners. And mutualism could provide a smooth transition to socialism from a market system if that's what we decided we wanted.
Who is Henry George, and what are Georgism and Geolibertarianism?
Henry George was an American economist from New York. He ran for New York mayor at the end of his life, and he focused on the land question, the issue of why land was expensive in some places like New York and inexpensive in other places like rural areas, California. His books were Progress and Poverty, The Irish Land Question, and a bunch of other ones. And his idea was tax land only, not labor and capital. It's not to say a Georgia system would see an increase in property taxes. It's a way to make sure that property values can go up without property taxes rising too. And it's a way to make sure that that the owner is paying rent on the privilege to exclusively own a parcel of land and exclude the rest of the community from it on community money. So it's really it's not so much a tax as it is a fee. For a service of exclusively occupying a parcel of land, but geolibertarians can get their mind around the idea that what's being paid for is actually commensurate with what people are receiving, and that's protection from the bad planning, bad economic planning, and possible blight, and just misallocation of resources that could potentially result from some producer being in their neighborhood and not paying enough tax to the community as a result for the cost the community is incurring for allowing him to possibly pollute and make the land unusable, let the land go unused, let abandoned properties sit there while taxpayers pay to protect it. And Georgism and Mutualism really understand how to prevent a first come, first serve landed property ownership system, how to prevent that from getting worse. And there's a critique that I think a lot of libertarians seem to be missing.
What goals do you think Georgists and libertarians share?
Georgists and libertarians both share a desire to decentralize government and simplify and reduce taxes.
Do you think there's anything that sets them apart?
Georgists and libertarians. Environmental policy is really at the core of where they could get along, but welfare policy is where they could potentially disagree. Because subjecting, libertarians don't want to subject anything to taxes. So it's going to be hard to convince them that we should subject land to taxes. Getting over that first hurdle of like, it's not going to affect your property unless you're actually, polluting or exploiting land or charging people too much rent or something. The idea of Georgism is to avoid, and libertarians understand this idea too, to avoid taxing production in a discouraging way. And that's just taxing it, whether that means don't tax it too much or don't tax it at all. Georgians do not want to tax productivity or labor at all, or income from labor, because they consider it an improvement upon land. And that is the thing, since it's happening above land, it shouldn't be taxed. There's one Georgist blogger named Adam Monroe who says, tax land, not man. And libertarians would hope that Georgists don't want to tax capital, but there's some Georgists who want to tax capital and view taxing mineral resources extraction as something important. And you potentially have a natural resource dividend that comes from that. So, Georgists want something that could arguably be described as welfare, and that's a potential sticking point between them and libertarians.
Okay, that's interesting. You got any thoughts on the presidential race? Some of the candidates that have announced?
Yeah, I don't like the idea of, I don't think I'm going to be voting for John McAfee, Adam Kokesh, or Arvin Vohra. In the Libertarians, I like Vermin Supreme and Benjamin Drake, who have been courting the Libertarian Socialist Caucus's vote. Vermin Supreme may seem like a silly candidate, but his explanation is just his joke about creating a fake pony bubble arguably shows that he understands economics better than most politicians do, even though he's got a boot on his head. I'm glad that Bill Weld has decided to challenge Trump. I hope more people will challenge Trump. I think the most likely two are, John Kasich, Jeb Bush, probably not Rand Paul, maybe Ted Cruz, maybe Marco Rubio. I hope more people will try to primary him. The Democrats, I like Marianne Williamson and Andrew Yang most. I think Marianne Williamson makes a good point that the president needs to be a moral leader, and I think she makes a good case for herself being one. I'm also going to be looking into green, considering voting for green and socialist candidates, because why not?
Did you see the? Oh man, it was kind of like who's that guy from Flex Seal? Phil Swift.
Okay, no, what did you do?
Phil Swift. Oh, somebody pranked Wikipedia, and they wrote that Phil Swift was running for president under the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. And there's this whole meme with this Phil Swift Flex Seal guy, Communist Party.
Yeah, you never know. I mean, it was Jimmy Dore, the comedian, who said Trump is a game show host, and the game show host became president. First an actor, now it's a game show host. You never know. Maybe a meme is going to be the next president. It can only get worse from here.
So you mentioned Andrew Yang. What do you think about universal basic income?
So the thing I like most about it is that people are talking about it. That doesn't mean I necessarily approve of it. It's just that there's so much education that needs to be done in terms of how many types of these programs there are out there. There's the basic income, there's the citizens dividend, universal basic income. There's all these different names for it too. You could have a natural resource dividend, but Andrew Yang's proposal is called a freedom dividend. It's supposedly going to cost somewhere between 1.8 and 2.4 trillion a year. It's roughly half the budget, but he intends to make those costs up by eliminating the welfare programs in the process, which is actually what Milton Friedman intended, the negative income tax. He didn't come up with it, but he defended it and explained it. It's about a 50, 60-year-old idea. But yeah, there's a negative income tax. There's all these kinds of new tax proposals that we need to look at, and everyone's just kind of proposing, hey, we could try to tax property more, tax income more, tax sales more. It's like, we've been doing that, just doing one or the other. It's like we need to look at taxing land, having voluntary taxation, having fee-for-service programs, and extending tax credits to people who are below the poverty line. And that's totally justifiable, even if it results in refundable actual cash payment. Because, any libertarian who will tell you that basic income is socialist or afraid of Andrew Yang's proposal, flawed as though it might be, and his gun control policy is another issue. But if a libertarian wants to tell you that all basic income proposals are socialist, ask him to tell you what the fair tax prebate is. Because Gary Johnson in 2016 supported what's called a preliminary rebate, a refundable tax credit that, in an anticipatory way, that anticipates all the tax costs that you'll be incurring throughout, on the 23% consumption tax for the national budget that you'll be incurring over a year. The fair tax prebate, the preliminary rebate, would refund you for all that tax money that you would receive for the year. So that's a libertarian supporting cash payments to people who need help affording things. And that really explains why Andrew Yang is citing people like Milton Friedman and Thomas Paine, kind of conservative-leaning people, to defend the basic income program, because it kind of reflects the idea that, well, first the two parties could come together, the two sides could come together, and you'd have a market-based system that results in more social ownership, but also kind of something that makes the government and all these programs more universal, more accessible to everyone, regardless of their wealth or whether they're working.
I hear you. I don't know if I don't see Yang winning. Probably be Biden or Sanders.
Yeah, it's difficult knowing that that's the probability, because I think Trump is just going to point to Biden's past sex scandals, and I don't think Trump will really focus on what I would focus on to criticize Bernie Sanders, which would be his war record, his monetary policy record, criminal justice. But yeah, I just have no faith in the neoliberal Democrats. I haven't for a full 12 years, ever since Nancy Pelosi said she wouldn't try to impeach Bush. Now she said she won't impeach Trump, as if that's new news. That came out a year ago, and people are freaking over it now. I never had any faith in Pelosi, Clinton, Biden, Obama, because I learned about these congressional member organizations, ideological CMOs, the New Democrats, and how the Democrats are being controlled by the Congressional Campaign Committee. And yeah, these neoliberal Democrats, they are all working together, and it's called a New Democrat Coalition. It's been dominating the Democratic Party over the last 25 years.
Oh, interesting. I've heard of them. Yeah, they have a bunch of groups. There's those guys. There's Justice Democrats, like a more progressive one.
Yeah, there's the progressive and the populist ones, and then there's the Blue Dogs. They're kind of conservative-leaning Democrats.
Yeah, and there's not too many of those.
No.
Yeah, the thing with the UBI is, I can never see like Congress going along with it. It's such an ambitious plan because it's a huge spending bill. Well, it would be permanent, I would assume. And he wants to replace, parts of the welfare state, or supplement it, or somehow make some savings there. I don't know. He wants to fund it with a VAT tax.
Yeah, he did mention a VAT tax, and I'm not convinced that it would be an ambitious plan, because it would aim to reduce kind of all markup and profit. Maybe that would be desirable. It would be very hard to collect, and it really just kind of turns the issue of whether you're going to purchase the thing into a very difficult and expensive decision for the consumer, from what I understand. So I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around the idea that the VAT is going to help, even though the fair tax is arguably a very similar system. But I want to focus on making sure that, the taxes are paid by the seller rather than the consumer, because remember, the seller is the one that has the more property. So maybe they should be taxed a little more than the person who needs to buy something. It's like we have to think about the classes of people who are engaging in these taxes, and not have preferential treatment based on what industry you're in and what firm you are and your contracts with the government and everything. But one good thing potentially about the basic income is that if people, knowing that we'll have $2 trillion a year sent to us if everyone is eligible to opt in, we could pull that money collectively and spend it however we want and use it to leverage the economic power and the purchasing power, the selling power of large sellers. So we could use our purchasing power to, bargain those prices down so that low income people can afford the things they need to survive.
Yeah, I got you. And another good thing, I think, just about Yang's presidency is that it just makes people think differently about the policy. Because it doesn't change a whole lot. You look at was it under Obama, the top tax rate was like 39. It was like 37 under Trump, 35 under George W. Bush. So I don't know. It hasn't been like big changes to the way we think about taxes in a while.
Yeah, and there really need to be, because simply taxing something because it's there, taxing an activity because it's there, because you can make money off it, that's not a good idea. You need to make sure you don't deter productivity in the process. And if you deter productivity with taxes, you're going to take away all incentive for people to work, because you're not letting them keep enough of their own money. And the bosses are taking their money, the government's taking their money, everyone, whoever's charging them fees to, hunt on their own property or whatever the hell. There's just everything's being turned into a for-profit service, even nature itself. And that's a fetishism of markets and property. That's not real free markets in my book.
Yeah, and a lot of libertarians have been supportive of getting rid of an income tax, and even saying sales or like a land tax, property tax, would be preferable to income tax. So maybe some of these things you're talking about, like Georgism or even Yang's idea, maybe they're not as far away from libertarians as people think.
Yeah, and if we can focus on taxing basically the hoarding of wealth at taxpayer expense, and the hoarding of wealth that arises due to government granting, businesses monopolies and opportunities to receive taxpayer money, just abolishing subsidies, then that's the only way we can actually have a real free market and people choosing who to buy from and not buy from, without having to hire a lobbyist to be like, hey, government, stop stealing this guy's money and giving it to these businesses, which we are then kind of arguably compelled and coerced to then work for and buy from. Is not anywhere near a free market that we have right now. And I agree with Ron Paul when he said we haven't tried free markets. And really, Georgism, geo-libertarianism, is just the application of free market ideas, of the idea of not deterring productivity with your taxes to is applying those ideas to taxes, and accepting the idea that we might possibly have voluntary taxation if we can all just agree on a system that would be better than the one we have now. And that is going to have to include taxing income less, because it's kind of like punishing people for earning money. Like, what's the point of that? You should be punished by taxes if you did something wrong, not just because you earned money.
So a few years ago in Portland, you discovered something very interesting about the right to bear arms. What was it?
So I went to the Bipartisan Cafe in 2014. It's a politically themed cafe, and I saw a copy of the Bill of Rights on the wall, and it had all this political memorabilia on the wall. And I noticed something interesting about it. I looked up later, it was the version of the Bill of Rights. It was a draft that was like 3 or 6 months before it was edited and formally adopted. And the Second Amendment was twice as long as from the way we know it today. And what they removed in those 3 to 6 months before it was adopted was the provision that protected our right to resist, through conscientious objection, the right to resist selective service and mandatory service in the draft. There's this phrase in there called, if you're religiously scrupulous of bearing arms, you don't have to render military service in person. And that means two things. It means if you're so good at being well trained, like religiously, like, you have, like, you're very good at being, scrupulous of your ability to train yourself. is kind of a double entendre, and it also means the ability to morally object. So it's a very interesting piece of history and language. It's a pun, the most fascinating legal pun I've ever heard. Is just lost when the Second Amendment was chopped in half. And the fact that this existed, it affirms to me that the original intent of the Second Amendment was to protect our right to shoot at tyrannical, corrupt government officials, especially when they try to draft us. And this applies to all armies, British, American, terrorist groups. Anyone who's trying to draft us deserves to get shot.
Speaking of military policy, what are your thoughts about the current situation in Venezuela?
So it worries me. Trump saying that, Guaido is the legitimate president of Venezuela in his State of the Union address is going to go down as one of the biggest blunders in State of the Union history, unless he decides to, turn his words into action. I don't know how we're going to solve a country whose chief problem is poverty with military intervention, but I guess that would help Guaido get in power. And I don't think a draft would be necessary to bring it back, but I wouldn't put messing with the draft and bring it back just to mess with us. I wouldn't put that past our politicians. But I think this is just another war for oil. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger even than Saudi Arabia. And Trump admits that he just wants to basically start a war in that country in order to take the oil as to the victor go the spoils. And as a reminder, the strong evidence that the U.S., the CIA worked with foreign elements to kidnap Chavez in 2002 and return him to power after 2 days. And there's evidence that Guaido he studied political science at George Washington University, which is one of the top 5 militarized universities in America and one with known CIA recruiting presence. So it's possible that he was handpicked to be the next leader of Venezuela. There's also issues like that might be from Colombia. The British are keeping the Venezuelans gold because they don't want them to have all this money. And America and other countries are blockading the oil shipments, but it's not really an official, technical, legal blockade because, of course, they wouldn't let it be. They wouldn't admit that. So all these forces are colluding to stop Venezuela from unloading and selling its oil riches and making money based on using that gold in British reserves, which, by the way, it's keeping because Venezuela wouldn't sell its oil fields to Britain, to BP. But yeah, we're blaming socialism on the destruction of Venezuela when it's our refusal to trade with them and our interruption in their ability to sell their stuff to other people.
Yeah, and Venezuela is a country, I think, that the government of the U.S. has wanted to fall for a while.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, Chavez was kidnapped for 2 days. It was in 2002 or 2003, one of the first few years of the Bush administration. So yeah, maybe that was one of the silent members of the axis of evil that he didn't want to tell us about. Maybe we've heard about this peak oil idea since 2005. So it's obvious, the Bush family, has a history in oil. So did the Koch brothers. So yeah, it's all about oil speculation.
Where can viewers go to see your blog, buy your books, watch your YouTube videos?
So my blog is on the internet at www.aquarianagrarian.blogspot.com. And you can go to the last article under the May 2017 tab. You can just go to the right column and follow the years and months. Go down to May 2017 and click on the one about 3 books, and you can follow the links to bookpatch.com, or you can buy Libertarian Conspiracy Theories, Soft Communism for 90s Kids, which are my collection of political essays, and also my book, Time, Money, Moon Value. And also you can learn more about all the topics I've discussed in this interview by clicking on the links in the description of this video.